Hello， 大家好，欢迎回到外媒看中国，我是安博然。In yet another acceleration of America's high-speed race toward the edge of a metaphorical but very real cliff, US Secretary of State Marco Rubio has announced that the Trump administration will specifically target Chinese students in a new visa policy that he says puts America first, not China. His short statement, posted on the Homeland Security website, says they will aggressively revoke visas for Chinese students and change their policies specifically for China. This comes after an announcement yesterday that student visa applications to the US had been temporarily closed. But the American embassy in Beijing didn't seem to have received that memo, announcing that they are still processing Chinese visas as normal. Oops. Is Mr Rubio mad that despite becoming US Secretary of State, China still hasn't removed his ban on entering the country? Today I'll ask my special guest, Professor Warwick Powell, as we go beyond the propaganda. This is Reports on China. I'm Andy Boreham here in Shanghai. Let's get reporting. China recently announced another 4 countries are joining its visa-free travel policy, bringing the total number of countries whose citizens can visit China without a visa to 47. The new entries include Brazil, Kuwait, and Bahrain, who join existing nations like New Zealand, Australia, Italy, Japan, South Korea, and Ireland, in a policy which has, in my opinion, been the best antidote for Western anti-China propaganda, allowing ordinary people to ignore biased and scaremongering reports from the likes of the BBC, CNN, and the New York Times, and come and see this country with their own eyes. This unprecedented openness comes as the United States becomes more and more suspicious and closed off, deporting massive numbers of international students there, for example, who express views that Washington doesn't agree with. Just yesterday, the Trump administration said it had ordered US embassies around the world to stop issuing student visas as they ramp up social media checks to make sure that only people who say the right things are granted access. The BBC ran with the headline, US halts student visa appointments and plans expanded social media vetting, where they wrote, US President Donald Trump's administration has ordered US embassies around the world to stop scheduling appointments for student visas as it prepares to expand social media vetting of such applicants. An official memo said social media vetting would be stepped up for student and foreign exchange visas, which would have significant implications for embassies and consulates. But as a sign of the haphazard and disorganized manner of the Trump administration, the US Embassy in Beijing, to the contrary, says they never received any such notice and are still processing student visa applications as usual. When contacted by China's CCTV, embassy staff said they had not heard about the apparent suspension, adding, "Currently, all visa procedures, including applications and interviews, are operating normally. Appointments can be scheduled through the official website." And then today, Secretary of State Marco Rubio, who's still banned from entering China, announced that the Department of Homeland Security will specifically target Chinese students. I'll read his brief statement in full. It's headlined, "New Visa Policies Put America First, Not China," and reads, "Under President Trump's leadership, the US State Department will work with the Department of Homeland Security to aggressively revoke visas for Chinese students, including those with connections to the Chinese Communist Party or studying in critical fields. We'll also revise visa criteria to enhance scrutiny of all future visa applications from the People's Republic of China and Hong Kong." Now I want to bring in adjunct Professor Warwick Pal from the Queensland University of Technology, who's also a senior fellow at the Taihe Institute. Professor, apart from Rubio falsely listing China and Hong Kong as separate entities, what can we make of this sudden push to target Chinese students specifically? I mean, China is the largest buyer of US education, bringing the United States up to an estimated $15 billion per year. What's going on?
Well, good to be with you again, Andy. The latest announcements really are an expression of a deep-seated anxiety and paranoia about China, not just an anxiety that has been evident in the last half a dozen or 10 years, running so far as the China Project, which targeted Chinese researchers working in American institutions in recent years. But this actually goes back well over a century when the United States introduced in the late 1800s the Chinese Exclusion Act, which aimed to prohibit Chinese workers from entering the United States. So there is something a little bit deep-seated about all of this. The other interesting thing about this in terms of this last 24 hours is that American courts have actually determined that the Trump administration or the presidency itself does not have the authority to go down the path it has done in relation to tariffs. Now, of course, the administration will appeal that, but I think what this suggests is that this rushed announcement, evidenced by the fact that embassies have not been availed of the information, this rushed announcement would suggest that it is a political reaction to distract a little bit of attention from the court coming to a view that the presidency has exceeded its authority in relation to the unilateral tariffs of recent times.
Now I want to ask you a bit about that policy of checking the social media accounts of student visa applicants. Now, obviously, this goes against the very core of US's supposed beliefs, right? That being the so-called idea of freedom of speech. I just want to add, it also applies to ordinary visitors to the US as well. When I went to the United States recently, even though I come from New Zealand, which is a country that doesn't require a visa to travel there, I had to first submit my social media profiles to US Customs, presumably for them to check them out first. Now, the interesting thing is, I think if you ask any random American which country they think has such a social media policy, China or the US, I can guarantee you they'd assume it was China, but China has no such a policy. What's your take on that?
Look, it is a little bit bizarre in a sense because the working assumption that a lot of people have is exactly as you described, which is that the United States is the land of free speech and these sorts of issues wouldn't be of concern to the authorities. But again, let me say that reality and rhetoric are two different things. And in the United States, there has been many decades of deep state surveillance of its citizens, as well as the availability of data on citizens for commercial purposes. So much so that people's own social media accounts have been scraped for many years to populate commercially available profiles for prospective tenants. So landlords will purchase tenancy application worthiness data on prospective tenants, and part of the profiling that they get is actually data on someone's social media, comments and those sorts of things. And the reason for that is not only to ask the question, is so-and-so going to be good for the rent? But the question that's really being asked is so-and-so the kind of person that I want to be renting out to? So profiling people in terms of what they say and has been actually part and parcel of how the American system has worked for many decades, despite the rhetoric that it is something that it doesn't do.
Yeah, I just want to mention to people, I mean, a lot of people are terrified of coming to China in case they've said something online that might be taken as anti-Chinese in the past. China has no such policy, so head over here. Now, I mentioned earlier how Marco Rubio is still barred from entering China, having received a travel ban back in 2020. Now, the funny thing is, knowing how cocky he is, I'm pretty sure when he received the role of Secretary of State this year that he would have thought China would bow down and remove his travel ban, which of course they didn't, and I don't think they have any plans to do so. Now, I can't imagine that making him very happy. So do you think that any of these current moves against Chinese students specifically might stem at all from a personal vendetta?
Look, far be it for me to get inside the head of the Secretary of State, and I'd probably suggest that the recent decisions are a little bit less to do with his own personal views and a little bit more to do with that broader context that I described earlier. The United States, particularly its political establishment, has arrived at a bipartisan position which sees China as its greatest threat and adversary, and the levels of paranoia and anxiety that go with that are reaching new heights. And I think that the announcement by Secretary of State Rubio today simply reflects that particular atmosphere.
So you don't think he has any room to insert his personal biases, or maybe just a little?
Well, everybody will have their own personal views about something, and I guess if he wanted to push back against any of these kind of moves. In theory, he could. But at the end of the day, this is really a view that reflects the broader consensus position that the United States political establishment has arrived at. So even if he did have a personal slight in relation to his current status, I don't think it's a particularly big factor in this.
Okay, last question today, Professor. Now, obviously, you're an academic. This is your field. So what advice would you give to any international students, and not just from China, but anywhere, who might perhaps be considering studying in the US in 2025?
Look, the United States is clearly becoming a less predictable and, to some extent, a less safe place to go for international students. It's less safe in a few different ways. One is, of course, the risk that your visa status can be capriciously altered, which means that you could be halfway through your studies and suddenly having to pack your bags and go elsewhere. But of course, we also know that there has been from time to time serious incidents of physical violence directed towards people who ostensibly look, quote, Oriental, unquote, in the name, of course, of this reaction towards China. So the question now for international students or students from anywhere else in the world is whether or not there are alternatives. And the fact is that the world is bigger than the United States. And whilst United States higher education institutions have historically been, in many cases, at the pinnacle of teaching, learning, and research, in recent years they have been, if not sliding down the scale, they've been caught up by institutions elsewhere. And those institutions offer tremendous opportunities for students who want to pursue international studies experiences. So I'd see this less about the United States per se, what the United States chooses to do as far as putting walls up around itself and kicking people out and scrutinising people's social media accounts on entry is a matter for the United States. But people thinking about visiting or travelling, let alone thinking about a longer stint stay as an international student or even as a researcher, will need to think again and explore their alternative options elsewhere. And there are many of those.
Great advice, Professor Warwick Powell. Thank you so much for your time today.
Absolute pleasure.
And on that note, that will be it for today, you guys. But as always, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Why do you think the current US administration is so lacking in self-confidence? And what do you think they'll do next to speed up America's decline? Do let me know down below. And don't forget to hit like and subscribe if you haven't already. It really does help the channel. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.